Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto was adopted by Uchiha Mikoto. Uchiha Mikoto takes the hand of an outcast child, and with it rewrites the destiny of her clan. Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 11. Keeping up the clan shrine was the head's wife's duty. Amidst everything else, Mikoto was overdue. She left her sandals on the stones, and bowed once before the open doors. She was asking the ritual permission of the spirits of the dead to enter their house to seek counsel. The interior was mostly bare wood, with an altar at the back, and a small hidden closet for extra incense, candles, a few moth-eaten meditation pillows, and some cleaning supplies. The only decoration was the fan symbol painted on the walls. She replenished the consumables on the closet shelves from the small box she brought with her, then took out the broom to begin half-heartedly sweeping the floor clean. It was a place for quiet reflection, meditation, and mourning. Or it was supposed to be. Whatever Itachi had seen here had soured his opinion of the elders past the point of salvageability. Her chores complete, Mikoto lit a stick of incense, and knelt before the altar. She pulled 4 photographs from a fold in her kimono, and spread them over the dark wood. A 10-year-old Obito showing off his brand new Hitai. Herself as a little girl, holding her baby brother in a sling, the twins standing behind her with a protective hand on each shoulder. Her mother and father, beaming on their wedding day. Her mother's parents, sitting on the mansion porch, smiling down at the newborn cradled in her grandmother's wrinkled hands. She placed her palms together in prayer. She was here to seek guidance from her ancestors. And she was terrified that one of them in particular just might answer. She had more to fear than most, perhaps, that Madara's taint had somehow lived on. She was, after all, his great-granddaughter. Not in the official genealogies, tended by the old men who carefully put everyone in their place, no. The Uchiha were more obsessed than any other clan with the purity of their ancestry, and in their books she barely even existed. In their accounting of the world, Madara had died before he produced an heir. But she knew better. When a nameless camp follower appeared at Konoha's palisade, beside a little boy with raven black hair, a Sharingan, and the power of a grown man, the Uchiha took her in. They called her a filthy whore behind her back, but they took her in. She told that boy, in secret, who his father had really been, and the truth of it was passed down from generation to generation, an open secret among the clan. She took no pride in that knowledge. To Mikoto, it was the greater shame that she was descended from a patricidal lunatic than a poor and desperate peasant woman. She was no great believer in destiny, but the niggling idea that she shared one with Madara was something she couldn't discard out of hand. Was it true? Were they all cursed? Did some seed of evil lie dormant behind their crimson eyes? Shinobi made hard choices. Their very livelihood depended on bringing pain, and even death, to often innocent people. She herself had done so. The Uchiha were very good at it, but that wasn't evil. The sharp blade was no more or less cruel than the dull, they were both tools. How a thinking, feeling person wielded those tools, that was a different question. Sometimes her clansmen came back from their missions looking as haunted as their teammates at the bloody work of their own hands. Sometimes they came back wearing smiles of cruel triumph. They were people, good and bad. What was evil, then? Lust for power, to oppress rather than protect? Vengeance without justice? Destruction without creation? If that was so, she had nothing to fear. The people in front of her had venerated none of those things, and they were the truest of the Uchiha, direct descendants of Madara himself. Mikoto gathered up the photographs, and stowed them away, then barred the door with her broom. She lit one of the tapers she'd found in the storage closet. In the flickering candlelight, she peeled up the 7th mat from the back of the raised altar platform to reveal the bare wood beneath. She knocked experimentally to find a hollow. There was none, it was too cleverly concealed, but her sensitive fingers found a small catch at the base of the wall. She flicked it forward, and a section of the planking popped up a fraction. Using a kunai as a lever, she pried up the heavy trapdoor, to reveal a set of stone stairs descending into utter darkness. It was dry and musty, and the stale air made her cough. Her candle illuminated another room beneath the main shrine, stone instead of wood, and clearly very old. There were seal tags pasted on the walls, and they flared violet as she passed, probing her. They seemed satisfied with what they found, since the two old braziers before her suddenly flared to life to welcome her further into the chamber. What they burned she did not know. Before her was another altar of plain grayish stone, flanked by a mural of two fearsome winged beings with fiery swords. The inscriptions on the front were indecipherable. Above the altar was a framed square of yellowing paper, which she could read, although the full meaning of the words eluded her. For 1,000 years, we have kept this knowledge. The eyes of the unfavored son may look upon it, and learn the secrets of his power. When he has set his feet upon the cursed path, he may look yet deeper. Only the eyes of his father may see all and know all. Mikoto puzzled over the short message. The last line could refer to the Rakudo Sennin, who, if myth was to be believed, possessed a dojutsu so powerful he could be called a god. His eyes could see anything and everything, force demons to their knees, bring back the dead, and warp reality itself around his will. But no story she had ever heard had painted him as a father, and besides, that's all they were, stories. There was no historical evidence the man himself had even existed. Only the Biju had lived long enough to remember that misty past, and they would never tell the tale of their subjugation willingly. The top of the altar was covered in the strange script as well, although the chisel marks were not so worn with age. In the center was a circle, inlaid with red jasper and onyx, in the shape of 3 tomo. She activated her Sharingan, and looked again, and as she did the stone tomo seemed to spin along with her own. The random jumble of strokes rearranged themselves into words. It was written in code, a code only a Sharingan could perceive, and interpret, in its entirety. It read: The Sharingan is awakened for the first time when a son of the Uchiha looks upon a god of death, and sees his face reflected in its eyes. But it is only mastered when he becomes that god, and one whom he dearly loves looks into his eyes, and sees their death there. In the left eye, a weapon to obliterate the minds of all your enemies. In the right, a weapon to obliterate their bodies. From both springs the shield about you that no weapon may pierce. It is power born of pain, and pain will be the price paid for its use. Like the grief from which it came, it will devour the sunlight of your world, until all that is left to you is darkness. This is the Mangekyo Sharingan. I was not the first and I will not be the last. There was much more she couldn't read, the characters hovering on the edge of her comprehension. But she could decipher the last line, which read: Uchiha Izuna, year 897 of the age of the Rakudo Sennin. Sickened, she withdrew the chakra from her eyes, and the inscription dissolved into unintelligibility. Izuna was Madara's younger brother, his second in command, and the beginning of the line of clan leaders that currently ended with Shisui. She understood now. This secret had been Itachi's initiation as the heir to the Uchiha clan, when he was given the rank of Jonin at 13. Implicit in this revelation was the suggestion to seek out this power, and lead the Uchiha to glory as Madara and Izuna had done. Madara, who, it was said, had murdered his own father, and after being stricken blind plucked out his own brother's eyes in a desperate attempt to heal himself. There could be no trust in such a clan, if you feared those closest to you. To protect yourself from your own family, murder would always be on the forefront of your mind. Love was a liability, not an asset. How many of the Uchiha had chosen this path? How many of those names carved on the memorial stone had actually been felled by their own kin? Mikoto doused the candle, and fled the shrine, barely stopping to kick the tatami mat back over the entrance to the secret room. She threw a cloak of genjutsu over herself that rendered her invisible, loath to stop and speak to anyone. She only removed it when all the pressure of the chakra around her had ceased, and she was truly alone. The training field in which she finally stopped was rarely used, untidy and overgrown. It was dominated by an enormous fig tree, the spread of the branches easily enough to cover the area of a small house. She sat down in the crook of one of the buttressing roots. A ring of stones had been set around the trunk, most already toppled from below by the tree's growth. She brushed the moss from the carving with one hand, revealing the mirrored trees of the Senju clan symbol. This must have been one of Hashirama's. According to village legend, the valley in which she now lived had once been a battlefield, all the growing green long burned away by the fires of never-ending war. The Shodai had very literally created the village, causing sheltering trees to sprout where none had grown for 100 years, the village hidden in the leaves. His clansmen were free of the taint that plagued hers. The Senju died for each other, not by each other's hands. That was their will of fire. How comforting it must be, to be able to trust so deeply, and it had served them well. There were very few left that carried the Senju name, but it was a product of success, not failure. They had never been so fanatical with the purity of their blood, believing their strength lay in diversity. The clan split, and grew, and split again, and never lost the unity of that ideal. More may have the Uchiha name, but their number were dwindling. And what united them, beyond arrogance and power lust? Madara seemed to believe that's all there was, and need be. How many had followed him? Mikoto let her head drop against the entwining roots. They shielded her from the worst of the wind, like a little girl nestled in her grandfather's lap. Had the Shodai known the secret of the Sharingan? How his rival achieved his power? The truth was lost to history, but it was possible that he did. He was a great general, and very wise, little would have escaped his notice. And still he extended his hand in friendship to the Uchiha. Perhaps he saw more honor in them than they saw in themselves. The thought thawed some of her shame, and she looked up into the branches. Maybe Hashirama believed in them, believed they could resist that temptation. She finally let herself smile. Some had. Her twin brothers had both mastered their Sharingan. They must have been taken to the altar, and read what was inscribed there. And yet they were inseparable, the younger going so far as to follow the elder into death when he was killed by the Kyuubi. She herself could never do it. She loved her sons more than anything, even power. Even Fugaku and Shisui had how they had bristled when Fugaku's uncle had suggested Itachi be eliminated, agreeing only under duress. A Mangekyo Sharingan might even have been enough to tip the balance of power irrevocably in the Uchiha's favor, and still, even fanatics, it seemed, had limits. A few had undoubtedly followed Madara down that path. Most hadn't. Even with power aplenty, a life lived with that pain always in your heart wasn't worth living. Her heart was still heavy with worry and unanswered questions, but she had a mission to complete. Stealthily, she worked her way back to the village center in time to make the rendezvous at the Nara pharmacy. She greeted the clerks, and asked for Yoshino, the head pharmacist. They were playground acquaintances, not really friends, and whenever Mikoto saw her she seemed to be scolding her son Shikamaru for something or other. He was in Sasuke's class, and according to the boy's mother was as unmotivated and lazy as Sasuke was driven, only one place above Naruto in the class rankings. The harried-looking woman emerged from the back wearing a pharmacist's coat, and an old rank badge, proclaiming her to be a Chunin medical specialist. She motioned Mikoto over to the private alcove used for patient consultations. "Here you are, Uchiha-sama," she said, handing Mikoto a plain white paper bag. "I'm sorry about the wait, it's getting into flu season, and we're swamped here." "Thank you, I understand," she said. "I'm sure I'll be seeing you and Shikamaru-kun at the playground again soon." Yoshino leaned over the counter, letting the bland smile drop. "I don't know what's going on between the Hokage's council and the Uchiha," she whispered. "But it has my husband as worried as I've ever seen him." She straightened, and continued in a louder voice. "I hope you'll be feeling better, but if you don't mind I need to go back to counting orders." Mikoto said her goodbyes, paid for the medicines, and left. Once home, she pulled the small scroll from the pill bottle, and slipped it into a secret compartment of her jewelry box. Naruto and Sasuke had shown up a little while after she did, the blonde boy ravenous as usual. He started shoving the snacks she'd prepared in his mouth as fast as he could, while Sasuke looked on with distaste, and nibbled on his share. Mikoto left them, and withdrew to her bedroom, lying down on top of the quilts. Her head was pounding with the accumulated tensions of the last few days. Once she met with the Hokage, there would be no going back. Herself against Uchiha Madara. She could only pray that her guesses were correct, and he really was just a bitter, broken old man. She heard soft steps on the stairs, and Sasuke peeked around the sliding door. "Mom?" he asked, hesitantly. "Are you okay?" "Of course I am," she said, sitting up. "Where's Naruto?" Sasuke didn't look convinced. Still stuffing his face, he said, and padded into the room. I'm not that hungry. He heaved himself onto the bed next to her. First it was Itachi, and now you are acting funny. If it was something I did, I'm sorry. Mikoto cut him off by wrapping her arms around him, and squeezing him tight. You've never disappointed me, Sasuke. For a brief moment he relaxed against her chest with a blissful sigh, at least until he heard Naruto knocking around downstairs. He wiggled out of her embrace. Geez, Mom, don't do that. Naruto might see. I wouldn't worry about it, she said with a faint smile. I still hug him too. Sasuke snorted. Well, he's younger than me, so I guess it's still okay. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed, and paused before jumping down. Are you sure you're not sick or something? Shikamaru's mom said you went to their pharmacy today. It's just for the headaches. Nothing serious, she assured him. I'd like to lie down for a while, so if you could train with Naruto till dinner. Okay, he said, taking the hint. He flunked the last kata test bad, but I think that's cause he kept pouring mud in Mizuki-sensei's coffee. Maybe we can work on the next set. That's a good idea, she agreed. Sometimes the best way to learn something really well yourself is to try to teach it to someone else. Sasuke slipped off the bed, and flicked off the light on his way out. Feel better, okay? A good while after Naruto had reluctantly wandered home, she got Sasuke into bed, later than usual. He'd worn himself out trying to keep up with Naruto in their practice, and was yawning hugely. He probably wouldn't be waking up in the middle of the night, but she couldn't take any chances. As she was tucking him in, he took one look at her whirling sherry non, and fell back against the pillows with a gentle thump. A few hand seals afterward ensured he'd be out for hours. She could at least make sure he had pleasant dreams. Mikoto retrieved the scroll from her jewelry box, and stole into the night. She took the long way round, looping in a wide arc around the Hokage's tower. In the shadows of a back alley stairwell she pulled the scroll from her vest pocket, unfurled it, and pressed her thumb against the scanning seal. A viper mask, a cloak, and a photograph of the woman she was impersonating appeared on the ground. She stood and performed a henge. There was a small swirl of smoke as her dark hair became short and pale green, and her slender figure filled out to that of a stocky brawler. On top of the henge she wove another genjutsu, a chameleon skin that made her nearly invisible against the star-studded sky. She resumed her trek to the Hokage's office, taking the rooftops like an Umbu agent would. As she approached, she could feel their eyes on her, but the attention was curious, rather than threatening. She landed silently on the roof to wait, and dispelled the genjutsu. Another agent stepped out of the shadows of the horn-like columns to guide her inside. It was difficult to tell in the dark, but the loose, unruly curls above the badger mask looked very familiar. She stilled her anxiety, and probed a little deeper. The gentle fluttering of affection against her chakra sense was even more so. The Hokage is expecting you, he said simply. She smiled behind her mask. This was the first good news she'd had in what felt like an eternity. It looked like Uchiha's hero had returned from the land of lightning in one piece. She felt a stab of annoyance he hadn't told her before now, but it likely wasn't his fault. Contact between Umbu members and herself was risky, and even under better circumstances she'd seen him only rarely these days. Mention of his name made Fugaku squirm with poorly concealed jealousy. Dai's hero led her down the stairs, and through faintly lit hallways, to an inner audience chamber she'd never seen before. She dropped the henge, and shook out her hair. Before he opened the heavy wooden doors, he placed a hand on her shoulder. It suits you, he whispered. For what it's worth, I think you could have made it in. She entered, knelt on the thin mat in front of the Hokage's dais, and bowed. The room was very simply furnished, and the walls stained with years of pipe smoke. He was sitting cross-legged in the center, completely alert despite the late hour. His tall, white-haired student was lounging against the wall, as well. That she hadn't been expecting. As far as she knew, the Toad Sage had just retired, and was spending the rest of his natural life writing dirty books and getting kicked out of onsen. Perhaps, he wasn't nearly as retired as he wanted Konoha's enemies to believe. She'd never spoken to Jiraiya much, aside from the generalized shrieking that went on whenever he was discovered within spitting distance of the women's baths. The dirty old man act grated on her nerves, and, while Kushina and Minato were still alive, she had avoided him as much as possible. Still, he had survived at the forefront of 2 wars, and that meant he wasn't nearly as much of an idiot as he made himself out to be. He had traveled widely, and his information network was probably superb. "Sandaime-sama, Jiraiya-sama," she murmured. "Take off the mask." "I want to see your face," the Hokage said, not unkindly. Mikoto reached up to pull it off. She let her Sharingan blaze, not as a threat, but as a marker of her identity. She was loyal to her clan, and to her village. They were not mutually exclusive. "Mikoto-san. I would like you to tell me why you are here." Mikoto set the mask aside, and folded her hands on her lap. "Konoha is my home. The Uchiha are my family. I want to help you protect them both," she said. "But before we continue, I humbly request that you dismiss your bodyguards." Jiraiya's eyes narrowed, repraising her. There were 2 other men in the room, ostensibly invisible. She had caught their metaphorical scent as soon as she'd stepped through the threshold. "You can have me searched first, and my hands and eyes bound," she offered. "I'll tell you anything you want to know, but I must be sure that information doesn't wander." The Hokage considered her proposal briefly, and motioned the guards to leave. Jiraiya stayed where he was, openly suspicious. She did not request he leave as well. There was no way he was in Danzo's pay. "Thank you," she said demurely, once the 2 chakra signatures had faded away down the hall. "Shimura Danzo is still respected in certain circles, and it's my understanding he is attempting to use the Uchiha rebellion to further his own aims." The Hokage's wrinkled brows creased even further. "You are well informed, aren't you?" "Women gossip," she said with a slight shrug. He chuckled softly. "What I wouldn't give to be a fly on the wall at one of your tea parties." Hardly anyone besides Jiraiya, and a few hand-picked Umbu captains, are officially aware of that. Mikoto bowed her head, still demure. "People confide in me," she answered. "The Uchiha trust me. That is why I believe I am in the best position to solve this through diplomatic means. None of the clan outside of the council members, and their families, are aware a coup is being planned beneath their noses. Many of the peripheral families are of the same mind I am. They are loyal to Konoha, and loyal to you, and have no love for the clan council. The positions are inherited, they feel shut out of their own governance, and would welcome the opportunity to choose new leaders who truly respected them." "That is interesting," he said. "Extremely interesting. Go on." "My proposal is this: let me begin contacting the Uchiha who have the most to lose from a coup. I may not be able to convince them all to actively fight the council's plan, but even to take them out of the battle would be a victory for our side." "Our side?" His thin lips turned up at her choice of words, and he nodded in agreement. "If you succeeded in swaying the majority, you would have my never-ending gratitude," he said. "I have served beside many Uchiha, and have only respect for them, the recent unpleasant developments aside. I dreaded having to send Konoha shinobi against each other, although my entire council disagrees, and in such cases I can be overruled if there is an imminent threat to the village. I heard as much. Although I thought Homura-san agrees with you. That should have made it 2 against 1. The Hokage looked troubled, glancing away for a moment. "He agreed with me. It was rather odd, really. He doesn't usually fall on Danzo's side in situations like these, but after they came back from..." He shook his head. "You know Danzo is actively subverting your authority, don't you?" Mikoto said, frowning. "I'm sure you were curious why the talks with my husband broke down, even after the concessions you made? It was because someone was intentionally sabotaging relations with the Uchiha." "Yes, I know," he said sadly. "I've suspected for a long time, and Itachi told me exactly what you have. But even he could find no tangible proof it was anything beyond administrative incompetence, and without that there's no way I can convince your husband my word is still worth something. Then I assume he's also briefed you on the interference from Kiri, and the circumstances behind the Kyuubi's attack?" she asked. "He has," the Hokage said, the earlier good humor fading completely. "And I must say even I find this prospect frightening, although it explains a great deal. This is pure speculation, but it wouldn't surprise me to learn Madara has initiated some sort of alliance with Danzo. He was always too ready to compromise the long-term safety of his village for a short-term advantage, even when we were young. She agreed, with an apprehensive pinch of her lips. Madara knows how to use that kind of flaw. He seems to be playing for every side simultaneously, so whoever wins, so does he. That was what made opposing him so damnably difficult. He was so old, and so canny, you could not help but suspect any move you made was playing right into his hands, especially after having seen how thoroughly he'd manipulated someone as perspicacious as Itachi. But he was not omniscient, and living her life as she had might even have been to her advantage. He couldn't account for every variable, and maybe, just maybe, one mild-mannered housewife had fallen beneath his notice. We may have an intellect on our side to match his, although the man is still fairly young and hasn't the experience, the Hokage continued, and dropped his eyes sadly. I realize the rest of my council, and most of Umbu, cannot be trusted. He looked up again and smiled slightly, with a reassurance that warmed her soul. But this will be a battle of wits, not might, and numbers don't count for everything. With the weapons at hand, I believe victory is a strong possibility. Anything I can do to help you, I will, she said. You need only ask. Madara is a threat to every soul in Konoha, no matter who they've pledged their allegiance to. You do realize, he said, that what I ask may cause you a great deal of pain? Itachi has collected enough evidence to mark your husband as a traitor 3 times over. Even if you succeeded in keeping the majority of the clan loyal to me, his past actions cannot be excused. I realize he is being influenced by Madara, but even that is damning. It means there was already a base for him to build on. Mikoto looked down, and swallowed hard. I said what I meant. Anything. She paused and exhaled shakily. Her wedding vows were subservient to the oath she'd taken when she accepted her Hitayate, and although she no longer wore it, the words would bind her forever. This was what being a shinobi meant. If he'd asked her to turn against someone she truly cared for, like Sasuke, it would have been a more difficult decision, one she wasn't sure she could make. Fugaku may have been her husband, but it wasn't as if she loved him. But in return, I have a request, she added. Go on. Can you guarantee Sasuke's safety if the diplomatic solution fails? Itachi has already requested this as his price. Consider it done. Then I have another, she said, on impulse. If the rebellion is suppressed, and I survive, I would like to formally adopt Uzumaki Naruto as my son. I realize there may be resistance to this. I'm sure you can smooth it over. Jiraiya snorted, and joined the conversation for the first time. You were on Kushina's Genin team, weren't you? Under Kumo. Yes, sir. And you really care about this kid? I do, she replied, with pure conviction. Naruto, he changes people. I know it may seem odd, but if it hadn't been for him, I might not be speaking with you right now. I understand the reasons behind keeping him ignorant of the circumstances of his birth, but he doesn't deserve to be an outcast, and that's something I can change. Jiraiya and the Hokage exchanged some silent communication, ending with a faint nod from the Sunin. It wasn't my first choice, either, but after the Kyuubi's attack, there was simply nowhere for him to go. I couldn't place him in the care of one of the shinobi clans, or the balance of power would have been severely upset, the Hokage explained. You may make yourself some enemies on the Jonin Council, but your request is granted. I'll have the papers drawn up. Thank you, sir, she said, bowing very deeply. No, the Hokage said gently. I believe it is I who should be thanking you. Chapter 12. Mikoto's most important task now was finding allies. Collecting them would be perilous, but she had a good idea where to start. The hierarchy within the Uchiha clan was neither as formalized, nor as fraught with tension, as it was within the Hyuga. But the differences in status were there, and in skillful hands could be exploited. The clan head and his council were always chosen from the same 3 lines, regardless of personal merit. They were those who could claim direct ancestry from the great generals who led during the chaos that predated the founding of the hidden villages. There was resentment smoldering among the lesser families, whose members were no less capable, but still shut out from positions of leadership within their own clan. As she'd told the Hokage, Mikoto would be able to find friends among them. Some had turned their energies to gaining status outside of the clan structure, becoming respected teachers or diplomats. As a result, their sense of connection, and belonging, to the village as a whole was far deeper. Her own marriage to Fugaku was a hollow offering of peace that changed very little for those have-nots. Mikoto understood only too well what it meant to be shuffled aside in the greater interests of the clan, seeing promotions handed down, gifts bestowed, and favors done that benefited no one but the elite. The Uchiha were an old clan, and had old money, and set a portion of that aside to help members with unexpected expenses resulting from sudden deaths or accidents. That had been the idea, although to no one's surprise it rarely played out that way in practice. Somehow there just wasn't enough in the coffers when a neighbor's son was crippled on a mission, and she was forced to resign her position at the mission office to care for the boy. Or after another couple's baby was born deaf, and they couldn't afford the operation to restore her hearing. The elders enjoyed petty displays of power far too much, forcing those they perceived as inferior to plead on their knees for something that ought to have been given freely. And one incident struck particularly close to her heart. A terrible windstorm 2 years ago saw a tree crashing through the roof of the home her youngest brother Yuji had recently purchased with his fiancée. Fugaku wanted him begging for the repair money, like a dog for a scrap of meat, and even Mikoto's pleading hadn't softened him. Yuji refused, and had to take extra missions outside of his police patrols, while his wife ran herself ragged with extra shifts at the hospital, to get it fixed before the winter rains descended. He remained as outwardly polite to the clan head as ever, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent of hostility in their every interaction from that point forward. That was why Mikoto was standing on his porch, about to tell him a secret that could very well get him killed. For all of the harping over keeping the bloodline pure, the children of strong Uchiha didn't necessarily follow in their footsteps. Yuji, the baby of her family, was at best an indifferent shinobi. As a teenager, he had professed a desire to move to Odafukugai to pursue a singing career. The idea horrified their parents, was mercilessly crushed, and into a desk job at police force he went. His problem hadn't been a lack of skill, but rather an overabundance of compassion. Killing disgusted him, for any reason. He had been the oldest to activate his Sharingan, and was still a Chunin at 28, nothing for most shinobi to be concerned over, but a mark of complete incompetence among the Uchiha. Mikoto had made Jonin at 16. He did his best to make up for his merely average performance record by being intensely charming, with varying degrees of success. He had never managed to win over his brother-in-law, for one. Since the falling out 2 years ago, they waged a series of petty battles over family and police matters, which Fugaku won substantially less often than he would have liked. Yuji wasn't much of shinobi when it came to pure combat prowess, but what he did know how to do was talk, and he had refused to bow down to Fugaku. For this mission, that was exactly what she needed. She glanced at the scrap of paper proclaiming the doorbell to be unreliable, and knocked smartly on the door. This was his day off, and she knew he was home. There was no answer. She knocked again, louder and longer, and got the same response. She closed her eyes, and focused her senses past the door. She could feel someone inside, their chakra fizzing with irritation. She sighed, and backed up, until she was under his bedroom window. "Yuji, it's me," she called up. "Would you get out of bed? I know you're there." After a few seconds, the shutters opened. "You would, wouldn't you?" he said muzzily, scrubbing at his eyes. He was shirtless, and very much needed to shave. His face had an almost feminine delicacy to it, of which he was deeply embarrassed, and he'd grown a sparse beard in an attempt to lessen the effect. "Gimme a break, I had a long night. I'll be down in a minute." Mikoto returned to the front door, stuffing her hands under her arms, while she waited in the cold. He opened it after the promised minute, now draped in a robe, and invited her inside to wait while he got properly dressed. His home was small, cozy, and indifferently clean. His wife was a civilian nurse, and worked long hours at the hospital. Since he looked like he needed it, she put some water on for the imported coffee of which he was so fond, and found some dusty tea in the back of a cabinet for herself. He came back into the kitchen as the kettle began to whistle, and perked up a little at the promise of caffeine. Mikoto distributed the hot water, and brought her cup back to the kitchen table. He slid his elbows against the countertop, lounging against the lip next to the coffee press. "I need your help," she said, without preamble. His brows creased a little at her grim tone, but he smiled at her anyway. "Anything for my big sister," he said cheerfully, although the top of her head would barely reach his chin if they were standing side by side. She returned that smile, although it had gone cold with concern. "Do you mean that literally?" she asked. "Because I might have to take you up on it." He immediately straightened out of his slouch. "What's going on?" he said, his eyes narrowing. "Did something happen between you and Fugaku? If he hit you?" "No, he hasn't." "Not physically," she answered. "The problem is bigger than our marriage. Much, much bigger. I came to you because I know how much you hate him." Her bluntness gave him pause. "Oh. Well, he's my brother-in-law," he said, making a token effort at defending the family harmony. "Hate is such a strong—" "That will be the last lie you try telling me today," she said, as her dark eyes went crimson. "Do you understand?" Yes," he stuttered, taken aback. "Perfectly." She'd succeeded in frightening the flippancy out of him. It was time to reveal as much of the truth as she could. "I know why they've been watching us," she said. It was not necessary to elaborate on who. "It's for good reason. The Uchiha clan council is planning to overthrow the government of Konoha, a move that would leave the village crippled, and ripe for attack. Stopping them is an S-rank mission issued by the Hokage himself. I volunteered to select the team." Despite his mediocre mission record, he wasn't stupid. His eyes went wide, and he ran a hand through his shoulder-length black hair and turned away from her. "So you chose me, because you knew I'd never betray you to Fugaku." "Shit," he muttered to the cabinets. "Shit, shit, shit." Mikoto waited patiently, through the increasingly heated stream of profanity, as he processed the revelation. He'd never cared much for responsibility, but even less so for war. He had been hastily promoted to Chunin solely to fill in Konoha's lines on the Iwa border, and survived his deployment by luck alone. The atrocities he had witnessed and committed punctured his buoyant artist's spirit, almost driving him into an alcohol-soaked suicide. He was eventually rescued by the gentle hands and emphatic words of the nurse he later married, but Mikoto knew war was not something he would ever willingly face again. "Are you finished?" she asked, when the expletives had finally trailed off. He pulled out the chair opposite her, and slumped into it, his coffee forgotten. "Yes," he said, staring intensely into the whorls of the wooden tabletop, then glancing up into her eyes. "I'm not sure how much help I'll be, but it's yours. I don't think I'd last long in a Konoha under Fugaku's thumb." "How much can you tell me?" "Not much," she said, apologetic. "Only that the Hokage himself has no ill will against the Uchiha, and believes preventing a coup is in the best interest of both sides. Most of the political pressure against the clan is coming from other sources. I guess this explains why we've had Umbu breathing down my department's collective neck for the last 3 months, he said. "I could have sworn the Hokage had it out for us, and I couldn't figure out why. Came out of fucking nowhere. Some of the policy changes that trickled out of the tower, you'd think he was trying to piss off the entire force. In a way, that would be true, although it isn't the Hokage himself who's guilty of it. The village council learned of the coup this summer, and certain members have never thought kindly of the Uchiha," Mikoto explained, although she carefully did not mention who. "Yuji could work that out on his own. They exploited the opportunity. If the clan elders had been more willing to listen to the Hokage, and I mean really listen, we wouldn't be in this position. Instead, they've decided to force all of us into treason. They weren't even going to tell the peripheral families, until preparations were already underway." Yuji snorted. "Why am I not surprised? We peons get to do the bleeding while the elders sit back and sip their tea, I'm guessing? That's usually how this shit works out." "Fugaku didn't give me the impression it would be any different this time," she said. "But the Hokage is doing his best to avert a civil war, and is more than willing to reward any Uchiha committed to this goal. That means, we get S-rank mission pay for this?" he asked, hesitantly. They didn't usually talk openly about money, but he wasn't the most careful hand with a ledger, and she knew he had racked up his share of debt. The fee would be an enormous sum, at least 1,000,000 ryo. Usually S-rank missions were given only to experienced jonin within the Black Ops. Often, they carried at least a 50-50 chance the operative would not return. She didn't have to say it aloud, but this one was just as dangerous. Naturally, she assured him. The money wouldn't have clinched the deal, but would go a long way toward convincing him of the Hokage's good intentions. "All right," he said, sighing heavily. "What do you need me to do?" "I need names. People in the police force who agree with you, whether they know it or not, and have a reason to want the council gone. I'll be assembling them as well, mostly the women. At my order, and not before, I'll also need to plant doubts the coup will be as bloodless as Fugaku believes. Don't frame it as a question of loyalty, but survival. Being a loyal citizens of Konoha doesn't mean we stop being Uchiha." She had managed to pry out of Fugaku the date of the clan meeting at which he was to reveal his plans, and it gave her damnably little time. She and Yuji would have to work very fast. In the days that followed, her brother played his part well, coaxing intelligence out of his fellow officers without giving away the reasons behind his innocent questions. He put conscious effort into avoiding as much on-the-job responsibility as he could, and was perceived as too much of an incompetent by his superiors to be guilty of much underhanded scheming. It also helped that he had an obscene tolerance of strong drink, and a fat wallet, courtesy of Mikoto, with which to loosen their tongues. There was more resentment smoldering among the police than she would have guessed. Promotion was not always, or even often, based upon merit. The junior officers had to kiss the right boots, in the right order, for their superiors to suddenly recognize their talents. A few had grown disgusted, and quit to rejoin the general pool of active-duty shinobi. Most hadn't, even if they dreamed about it. The blue star of the police force was almost as much a touchstone of Uchiha identity as the Sharingan. They resented their inequitable treatment, yet couldn't leave it without leaving behind part of themselves. For her part, she concentrated on their daughters, sisters, and mothers, ferreting out half-remembered grudges and insults. Many of them were victims of the same stifling traditions that she was, their skills and talents tossed away to raise families they weren't ready to have. Not all the clans operated this way, despite the Uchiha elders' insistence that breeding more little Uchiha was the be-all and end-all of a woman's life. Among the Senju and its branches, Kunoichi retired when they were ready, whether that was 18 or 58. With Itachi as their messenger, lists of names were brought to the Hokage, combed over, revised, and finally settled upon, with only 2 days to spare. The conference would have to be held at Yuji's home, small as it was. It was much too dangerous to assemble the conspirators under her own roof. Mikoto trailed her eyes over the assembled group. Each one had been chosen with care. All were current or former shinobi. All had been wronged by the Uchiha elders. Itachi knelt at her right side, and Yuji on her left. For this phase of the mission, she was their captain. "I have asked you here for a purpose," Mikoto began, pitching her voice low and commanding. "It has recently come to my attention that certain elements within Konoha have grown dissatisfied with the leadership of Sarutobi Hiruzen. The leader of this rebel faction is putting into motion a plot to assassinate our Hokage and his council." Gasps rippled across the room, rebounding off the screens. The Sandaime was well loved, and under his rule Konoha had prospered. He had made his mistakes, like any leader, but in the eyes of nearly all his people the victories outnumbered the defeats. Many of the assembled shinobi were older, and remembered his leadership during the Great Wars rather than the trifling insults being flung at them in the present. "The Black Ops has been notified of this?" one of the jonin asked, his eyes flicking to Itachi. His dark hair was well into gray at the temples, and he had guided half a dozen genin teams into Konoha's higher ranks. He was also very well informed. Itachi's placement in the elite squad had not yet become common knowledge. "Yes," Itachi answered for her. "The Hokage's personal guard has been aware for some time. The leader of the coup is politically well connected, and as such the suppression of this rebellion cannot be accomplished through force alone. That is why we have assembled here today. All of you are respected, and above all loyal to Konoha. That is why I've chosen to share the identity of their leader, in the hope that you can aid me in keeping him from converting any more shinobi to his cause," Mikoto said. Around the room, heads nodded. What I am about to tell you may endanger your lives, and the lives of your families, but is critical to the continued survival of Konoha, and possibly the autonomy of the entirety of Fire Country. If you cannot accept this responsibility, leave. There was a moment of uncomfortable silence, and a few covert glances darted around the room. As she predicted, no one did. She smiled approvingly at the assembled Uchiha. Before I continue, I will need each of you to look me in the eye, and repeat the oath of loyalty you took when you accepted your Hitaiate. Yuji. Her youngest brother got to his feet, and crossed from his place, to kneel in front of her. This was more than a formality, and everyone in the room knew it. She activated her Sharingan, and drank in the details of the assembled clansmen, every nervous twitch and sigh. The Uchiha eyes were most famed for their use in combat, but they were equally adept at picking truth from lies, in the tiny gestures the body couldn't conceal. As a genjutsu user, who relied on reading the emotional, rather than physical, reactions of her opponents, she was exceptionally observant. Yuji bowed once, and began to speak in a clear voice. As a son of Konohagakure, I swear to faithfully defend the land of fire from all enemies, to complete my missions to the best of my ability, unless by my sound judgment I believe doing so would bring harm to my village, or my nation, and will obey all orders of my Hokage, and those captains he has set over me. If by my life, or death, I may serve my village, I will do so. He rose from the Seiyushian in front of her, and returned to his seat. Next, a tiny older woman named Sayori stood without hesitation, trembling against her walking stick from some old injury. She had served directly under Hatake Asekumo in the campaigns in Suna, where she had been known simply as the Dragoness, and almost single-handedly incinerated a quarter of the puppet corps at enormous risk to her own life. When she hobbled back to her seat, the next came up, and, one by one, every Uchiha repeated their oath. One by one, Mikoto's heart lifted. All of them were telling the truth, without reservation. When they promised to live and die in the service of Konoha, they meant it. Thank you. All of you, she said. I trust your discretion. What I am about to reveal is an S-class secret, and cannot be allowed to leave this room without the approval of the Hokage. The leader of this coup. She bowed her head and gathered her courage, is Uchiha Fugaku. The assembled shinobi were too disciplined to break down into mutterings, accusations, and arguments. They were silent, waiting for her to continue, wearing expressions of pain, betrayal, or knowing sadness. The clan council is under the mistaken impression that the Senju, and their old allies from the war years, are engaged in a conspiracy to oppress the Uchiha, and deprive them of the power my husband thinks we deserve. Everyone here is proof this belief is false. The Sandaime rewards shinobi who have demonstrated, in addition to great skill, an unwavering devotion to the ideal on which Konoha was founded. The rebels have betrayed this ideal. They never understood it. They've spit on the sacrifices our ancestors made, when they put aside hatred and vengeance against the Senju to create the first of the hidden villages. I cannot, and will not, stand by and allow the head and his council to split Konoha at the seams in a selfish grab for power. It will destroy us, and I do not mean our clan. Konoha itself may be annihilated as thoroughly as Uzushio if an assassination attempt succeeds, and civil war breaks out in its wake. Although it may mean turning against husbands, wives, brothers, sisters, students, teachers, friends, we are shinobi. We know where our allegiances truly lie. The plan has already been set in motion. The council thinks so little of you, they did not deign to ask whether you wanted to be involved in treason. They are arranging a war that you, not they, will have to fight. I do not think I have to remind you when our clan has faced this impasse before. There were more nods. It was the grandparents, and great-grandparents, of these shinobi that had opposed Madara most vehemently. They were the foot soldiers, the nobodies that died and were calmly ticked off on casualty rosters without a second thought. I know all of you have your grievances against them, and I believe it is time we cast off the last remnants of Madara's influence on our clan. His hatred has caused us nothing but pain, and it is killing us. A few of the male Jonin and Shinin looked questioningly at her, and one by one grasped her meaning. What are you proposing, Mikoto-sama? The youngest of the Jonin officers asked, a man in his late teens with a line of silver studs in his ears. The Uchiha clan council is our enemy, as well as the enemy of the Hokage. He has sworn to do the utmost to protect any Uchiha that stand with him, and listen sincerely to any grievances we may have. He knows how valuable the Sharingan is to Konoha, and how much the Uchiha have sacrificed for the common good. All he asks is that we allow his men into the district without opposition, to arrest the traitors. I realize the trust between the two sides has been eroded by recent developments. As a gesture of goodwill, he will allow an Uchiha officer to join every Umbu team, to oversee the arrests, and to ensure that no innocents are harmed if it can be at all avoided. Anyone who chooses to accompany the Umbu teams will not be required to participate directly in the action, but... She paused. I believe many of you will wish to do so regardless. It was Uchiha Enza that spoke up next, the Chunin that had been nursing a crush on Itachi. Her vivid aquamarine eyes were lowered in thought. Although they were beautiful, they held no latent Sharingan, a failing the clan council had taken pains to remind her of at every opportunity despite her excellent mission performance. Once the head and council have been removed, who will take their place? Shouldn't that be part of this discussion as well? Mikoto had been anticipating this question, although didn't expect someone so young to ask it. No wonder she was after Itachi. He was one of the few teenage boys in Konoha that wouldn't have any trouble keeping up with her intellect. You are correct, she told the young Kunoichi. I suggested to the Hokage that the current system of inheritance be scrapped, and he wholeheartedly agreed. All of you are here because I value your intelligence and experience, and I believe it should also be applied to choosing our leaders. Any Uchiha shinobi of Takubutsu Jonin rank, or higher, may submit themselves as candidates for a council seat, and the candidate pool will be voted on by everyone over the age of 16. Active duty shinobi or not, she added, catching the eyes of a few of the seated housewives. If a member dies, voluntarily retires, or becomes otherwise unfit for this duty, an election will be held again. And the clan head himself? Anzu asked. Roughly the same way we chose a Kage, Mikoto answered. He may be appointed by his predecessor, but that appointment must be confirmed by a majority vote by the Chunin and Jonin. The position will no longer pass from father to son without a check, she said, and looked to Itachi. As such I would no longer be heir, a position I am more than willing to relinquish, he said. I believe the Uchiha would benefit from a leader with more experience than myself. In this current case, all eligible clan members ought to vote for who will take my father's place. There were a few minutes of murmuring, as her clan members conferred with each other, and the tone of their whispers was promising. I believe I speak for everyone here, when I say this is more justice than I ever expected in my lifetime, Sayori finally said. If the Hokage stands behind it, I stand behind the Hokage. Until the time comes for him to act, what would you have us do? Nothing overt, Mikoto cautioned. The clan-wide meeting will be held in 2 days' time, as most of you know, and my husband will reveal the plans for the coup there. I want you all to attend if you can. Sayori-san, Genmei-san, Kinjiro-san, she said, nodding at each in turn, as war heroes your concerns about the coup will be given greater consideration than most. I want you to raise as many as you realistically can. Everyone else, stay on the quiet side, but watch for me. I need to know who else is likely to stand with us if fighting starts. And as promised to Snowcat, my 100th reviewer, an omake of cuteness and filthy children. I have 3 questions for you too, Mikoto said to the boys in front of her, her hands planted on her hips. They made little sticky squitch, squelch, squitch sounds as they shifted nervously from side to side. Where did you find this stuff? To whom do I owe the apology, and how did you get so much of it in your hair? We didn't, Naruto insisted. It found us. We were sparring in training field 9, minding our own business, and all of a sudden. After everything you've pulled, you expect me to believe you minded your own business into 6 liters of sugar syrup? She asked, every word dripping with incredulity. We really did. Sasuke insisted. I tried to get him out with my wires, but then I slipped, and it dries really fast, and... He let out a little moan and pressed his knees together. Can you please get our shirts unstuck? I really have to pee. Being a master of cleaning up sticky children no jutsu, Mikoto did, although the battle was not without its casualties. They included, but were not limited to, 2 pairs of boys' ninja sandals, the good fabric scissors, a whole bottle of soap, and Mikoto's last nerve. Go to your room, she ordered her damp, and still slightly tacky, son, after the two boys had finally been scrubbed to her satisfaction. You're grounded until I get a confession. But he's telling the, Naruto began. You too, she said. But it's halfway across town. He protested. Go. To. Your. Room. Meanwhile, at the ramen bar. You remembered to disarm all your trip lines this time, right? Iruka asked Izumo. Yeah, he said, as a steaming bowl of noodles was placed in front of him. You've been working at the academy, for, what a month. You already sound like our old sensei. Safety first, blah, blah, rules, blah, I remember when you used to be cool. I'm still cool. Iruka objected, loudly enough to make the other patrons turn their heads, and then continued in a less strident voice. But, you did. Yes. And besides. It's not like I left live explosives all over the place. They were all just gum traps. What's the worst that could happen? Chapter 13. The first meeting proceeded exactly as Mikoto had planned. Sayori's performance in particular was splendid. She was even smaller than Mikoto, and looked like a strong gust could whisk her off her feet, but she spent the meeting scolding Fugaku like he was a headstrong schoolboy again. Short of physically removing her from the meeting, Fugaku couldn't get her to shut up, and he couldn't do that because none of his officers wanted to be guilty of muscling off a, usually, sweet-natured granny in front of the entire clan. Genmei and Kinjiro, who had both led divisions in the war with Iwa, opposed him from the standpoint of tacticians, attacking with cold logic while Sayori took the emotional appeal. In the eyes of the council, it was a disaster, and Fugaku ranted at her for the better part of an hour after the meeting had dispersed. She quietly took it all in, murmuring her sympathies whenever he paused for breath. All three old troublemakers were very purposefully not invited to the next gathering, but that didn't have much of an impact. The damage had already been done. Objections were bubbling up from other sources now, ones she and Yuji hadn't even contacted directly. Fugaku's list of allies grew thinner every time they convened, but still, enough remained that it wouldn't force him to change his mind about the coup. Mikoto had hoped for but not expected such a thing. There was only one way they would be able to head off the plan entirely without bloodshed. And that was to get Shisui on their side. He would never betray his clan, but if he could be convinced that the Hokage was not his enemy, and the coup would do them more harm than good, he would drop his support. He was popular with the younger generation, and commanded the respect of the elder. If he turned his back, many, enough, would follow. Itachi and Mikoto were alone in the house, one of the few times they could speak freely. Her husband usually preferred formalities, addressing Itachi in one of the bare traditional rooms. The implications to his son were very clear. Speak only when spoken to, keep your head down, and do not dare to disagree. Since their secrets had been spilled, Mikoto always talked to him over the antique wood of the kitchen table, and 2 steaming cups of tea. It was incongruous, perhaps, to be discussing the progress of an S-rank mission in her kitchen, but Mikoto didn't need the trappings of authority to get him to listen. She already had Itachi's respect. I have to try now, her son said, in his usual level tones that masked the gravity of the subject they were discussing. Father will be naming the members of the assault teams next week, and Takuma-san's death will have made him more vulnerable. Uchiha Takuma, Shisui's father, had finally succumbed to his long illness yesterday. His son's position on the council was now official. It was what they'd been waiting for, as macabre as that was. Shisui was trained to bury his emotions like any shinobi, but the death of a parent, coupled with the assumption of his council members' responsibilities, would be taxing his composure to its limits. There were few he could turn to for support, and Itachi, although distance had grown between them, was one of those people. If his trust could be won, it would be now. Agreed, she said, reluctantly. When Itachi had proposed his plan a few days ago, she had initially opposed it. It would put an end to their problems in one fell swoop, but it put the loyalist faction at terrible risk. But while we can hope he'll listen to you, we can't expect it. I know how fond he is of you, but that may not be enough. If he perceives you as a threat to the clan, he'll try to arrest you, and if he tries to arrest you. Itachi's hands tightening on the slick surface of his cup. Neither of us will yield. Being forced to fight your own teacher is a terrible thing, she said, gently, and beyond that, secrecy is of the essence. There is so much hinging on the outcome. If he overcomes you, all of the loyalist leaders and the faction itself would be in terrible danger, and Danzo might succeed in pushing through his final solution, damning us all. I know, he said. But if I can turn him, I guarantee Konoha will know peace, without seeing the Uchiha turn on each other. Mikoto nodded. They'd already had this debate several times, and in the end she'd ceded victory to Itachi. Although none of it breached his uncanny calm, the persistence of his arguments told her he was desperate to save Shisui, even though it could cost him his life. I'm not trying to dissuade you. I want you to be careful. And I will be, he assured her. I've already requested he meet me at the Yakitori restaurant across the street from the hospital. He will be coming from the mortuary and will be mostly unarmed. Our sake will be drugged with tanglefoot. I've already started on a course of the antidote, and by the time we meet its effect on me will be minimal. Before the worst of the symptoms set in, I'll lead him to the river and speak my piece. If he doesn't listen, his vision and coordination will be too heavily impaired to make good use of the shunshin. Even without the element of surprise, I won't be far outmatched. Itachi looked past Mikoto's face, out the window to the bare branches scratching at the overcast sky. If the worst-case scenario becomes a reality, I'll need you to head him off before he can report everything to father. It's no secret you've been suffering from headaches lately. If you needed to retire early from the discussion, it would not arouse too much suspicion. Even drugged, I'm not a match for Shisui on my own, she told him, shaking her head. He's the worst sort of opponent I could face. Most of my genjutsu would be useless on him, and I'm not as young as I used to be. Even when I had barely a fraction of your ability in close quarters combat. Ah, but you would have the element of surprise. He half suspects I am disloyal, but does not harbor the same doubts about you. Also, he knows you are a chakra sensor. His first thought will be that you blundered into a fight searching for me, not that you are an assassin. Offer to heal him, since he will undoubtedly require it, and overwhelm his pathways with medical chakra before he can stop you. Mikoto turned his plan over in her head, probing it for any weakness. It was cautious, as he always was, and relied on his deep understanding of his opponent's psyche. Actually fighting Shisui herself would be suicide, but his plan would not require any exchange of blows. Once he was unconscious, it wouldn't be difficult to kill him without leaving behind the signs she had done so. Her assassination jutsu of choice did just that, a tiny, tightly controlled Raiden technique that wreaked havoc with the beating of the heart without damaging the flesh above it. Only an autopsy would reveal his death was a murder, and Yuji could ensure one was never performed, or the results falsified. The police would be forced to conclude that they'd gotten thoroughly drunk, quarreled perhaps, and fallen from the bridge. The Nakano was swollen with snow melt at this time of year, and peppered with jagged rocks. Every decade or so a child, or a genin undertaking a dare, would ignore the warning signs about the swiftness of the current, and drown. The water was too swift-moving to use chakra to gain a foothold, and even a shinobi as experienced as Shisui would have difficulty pulling themselves out in the darkness, without assistance. I can't find any fault with that, she said. Although I think we ought to have a medic nearby, if either of you were to require it. Taking you or Shisui to the hospital would raise too many questions. Ishimaru would do it, if I asked him. Your old student. Itachi said, dubious. I would prefer an Umbu medic. Umbu is compromised, she pointed out. Beyond Deus Hero, Kakashi, and Yojeo, we can't rely on anyone else to keep this from Danzo. Ishimaru knows what he's doing, and I trust him. Very well, he said. Yuji Ajizan's home is close enough to the bridge. I can only hope his skills are not necessary, but if something goes wrong, have your medic wait there. On the face of it, the clan was gathered to mourn the passing of one of their honored elders. Every Uchiha shinobi still outwardly loyal to Fugaku had packed into the main hall of the clan shrine. Young and old sat side by side, from the fresh genin to jonin on the cusp of retirement. Mikoto sat silently behind, and to the right of, her husband. Her eyes were downcast, and her face a mask of obedience. Even allowing for those few members whose duties had pulled them away, they would barely fill half of the large room. The numbers of Fugaku's supporters were dwindling. The empty places had not gone unnoticed, especially the seats on the raised platform reserved for the heir and the third member of the Elders' Council. The assembled Uchiha were looking pointedly at the empty Seiyushians, rumors spreading through the room like a contagion. Fugaku was prevented by propriety from pacing, while he waited for his wayward son and his teacher, who ought to have been sitting in the late Takuma's place. He had half expected Itachi to do something of the sort, but Shisui's absence was a total surprise, and it had thrown him off. Her husband was a shinobi, and could control his temper when he was forced to do so, but Mikoto could almost see the rage rising like a heat mirage from his broad shoulders. With the last of the stragglers had slipped in, the heavy doors of the shrine were closed and bolted. At Fugaku's signal, 4 senior genjutsu specialists, seated at each corner of the room, began the seals for a wide area barrier illusion, their hands flashing through the complex chain in perfect synchrony. Although the Hokage's viewing glass would be obscured by it, he had ordered the Umbu observing the memorial service not to even try breaking the genjutsu Mikoto warned them would be in effect. There was no need. She adjusted her sleeves, and flicked the tiny switch on the tape recorder secreted in the voluminous material. A chakra transmitter seal would have been able to record every treasonous word much more clearly, but, with so many Sharinon in the room, it was too dangerous. There was something to be said for doing things the civilian way now and then, with transistors and batteries, instead of ninjutsu. Most shinobi held such devices in contempt, believing their abilities to be far superior, especially the Uchiha. When the barrier team had finished their work, Fugaku quieted the uneasy muttering with a wave of his hand, and expectant silence settled over the room. "You know the true reason we have assembled here," he rumbled. "But let us have a moment of silence before we proceed." Cloth shuffled in the silence as all lowered their heads in prayer. Takuma had been a hard man, and was not well liked by the peripheral families. Still, it would not do to disrespect the dead in their own house, and no one interrupted the solemn quiet. When Fugaku judged that respects had been paid, he raised his head and brought his palms to rest on his knees, everyone else following his example. "Our time here is short, so I will come to the point," he said. "Our victory is nearly at hand. After careful consideration, I have selected the shinobi who ought to take part in the final mission. Those chosen will spearhead the assault on the Hokage's tower." There was an expectant rustling from the gathered Uchiha, as Fugaku began intoning the names of the chosen fighters and their team configurations. All 18 of them were close combat specialists, most upper-level Chunin or new Jonin, and on the younger side. 2 were her men, as insurance. It was unlikely the assault teams would reach the tower, and with her forewarning the Hokage and his council would not be there, but she wanted to plan for every contingency. "Hajin-san, Ike-san," Fugaku said, looking down at the 2 brothers in the second row. "You will use your centipede summons to plant remote trigger exploding tags inside the wall paneling of the council meeting room, when you deliver the next set of police report summaries. The action itself will take place 2 days later, as the village is preparing for the festival to celebrate the Nadime's birthday. All of the council members will be present in Konoha, and, as is tradition, will gather to recognize the shinobi with the best mission performance record of this year. There will be large numbers of people coming and going as the festival vendors check in, and various preparations are made to accommodate the crowds. After sundown, it will be a simple matter for you 2 to get within range, and activate the tags. The rest of you will mingle with the crowd until you receive your signals. The Umbu sentinels will be focusing their attention at the gates, not at the tower. Teams 1 and 2 will enter the tower through the breach and confirm the council was killed, or complete the task if they survived the blast. Teams 3 through 6 will intercept and dispose of the Umbu agents that will begin converging on the tower. Those officers not named as part of the assault teams will be focusing on quelling ground-level resistance. Your specific assignments will be distributed by your sergeant. Questions? One of her jonin on the assault team spoke up. "There will be an awful lot of civilians milling around the Hokage's tower, sir." Fugaku looked coldly at him. "Your point being?" "It could significantly increase hostility towards us if there are unnecessary civilian casualties during the transition of power. There's no less indiscriminate method of removing the council." "I second this," Someone else called out from the back row. Inwardly, Mikoto smiled, and more objections sprouted like mushrooms after a heavy rain. Her allies were stalling, mercilessly punching holes in the elder's plan, and dragging the proceedings on for as long as possible. They were operating as instructed. Itachi would need every second he could get. As the discussion wore on, Mikoto let her eyelids droop, and her breathing grow shallow and quick. When it grew close to the time of her rendezvous with Itachi, she let her breath catch on feigned pain, and put her hand to her temple. Fugaku broke off from an increasingly heated debate with a quarrelsome Chunin, when he noticed the young man kept casting concerned glances in her direction. "Are you not well?" her husband asked, too low for the others to hear. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "It's never been this bad before." Annoyed, he called out to her maid Iriko to escort her home. Mikoto let herself be led out, hanging her head in shame for allowing her weakness to be such a disruption. "Will you be all right, ma'am?" she asked, as they began the short walk home. "I can take you to the hospital if you're feeling faint." "No, that's all right," she said weakly. "I have pills at home. I wouldn't want to bother the medics over something like this." "If you're sure," she said doubtfully. "I know you've been under a lot of strain, especially lately, with Itachi-sama being, well." She trailed off and cleared her throat. Being at that rebellious age, she finished lamely. Even she knew that wasn't the half of it. "I'll be fine with some rest," she said. "Itachi must have been called away for a mission, and forgot to mention it." Iriko glanced at her skeptically. "I'm sure that's it," she assured her mistress uneasily. When they arrived at the house, Mikoto gently shooed the younger woman away, despite repeated offers of medicinal teas and neck massages. When she finally wandered back in the direction of her own home, Mikoto shut the door behind her. She began tearing off the formal silks with as much haste as she could muster, and quickly donned something she could move more freely in. She left a Kage-bunshin behind in the bed, and cloaked herself in a henge of an Umbu agent. So far from her real body, the duplicate wouldn't be very lifelike in its behavior, but as long as she was left alone to sleep away her headache, no one would be the wiser. She took off from the window, lightening her landings with chakra to keep curious Uchiha from investigating the lone Umbu prowling the district. The Nakano footbridge was about 10 minutes away, traveling quickly. The river provided Konoha with its fresh water, entering and exiting the village walls through reinforced grates embedded into the stone. She slowed as the babbling of the water grew louder, every sense on the alert and every nerve vibrating with anxiety. There were no sounds of battle, and she sensed no chakra signatures nearby. Their agreed-upon rendezvous point at a man-high boulder was deserted. Her heart contracted. Itachi hadn't been able to convert Shisui to their side. Had they killed each other? Or was Shisui lying in wait for her? If the worst had come to pass, she was the last line of defense the loyalists had. There was no way she would emerge the victor in a straight fight with him. Her only hope lay in misdirection. She dropped the henge of the husky Umbu agent, and began walking along the bank as herself, making just enough noise to announce her presence. At the edges of her perception she caught a chakra signature. A single one. It was hard to confirm, not purposely hidden, but faltering, weak. Mikoto quickened her pace. There was a body slumped against the trunk of a willow. His head lifted, and he looked straight at her. His features were shadowed, but she recognized Itachi's dark, straight hair. She rooted her feet to the ground. This could be a trap. She sent a Kage-bunshin to investigate, while she remained crouched in the shadows. They exchanged a few quiet words, and the duplicate dismissed itself. The memories of their chosen password settled themselves inside her head. Shisui was dead, the act of murder washed away by the waters. Mikoto left caution behind, and ran to her son's side. His dark clothing concealed the evidence of any injuries he'd received, but she could smell the blood on it, and his breath was coming in ragged gasps. She did not expect him to return from the confrontation unscathed. Maybe he could have succeeded with the element of surprise, but that had to be sacrificed when Itachi revealed his true loyalties. "We need to get out of here. How badly are you hurt?" He looked at her like she was a stranger. It was then that she noticed his eyes. The three tomo had lengthened into blades, joined at the pupil. He didn't answer, looking past her shoulder at the rushing water. "He wouldn't listen to me," he said, between labored breaths. "After everything, he wouldn't listen." Her eyes prickled in sympathy, for the tears he would never shed. Shisui had been first his teacher, then his captain, and finally his friend. In their own ways, they had both been working toward the same goal, the continuing survival of the Uchiha clan. She had hoped, prayed, that Shisui would be able to look past what he would perceive as a betrayal, and join them. The irony of it was suffocating. That Itachi would be the first in 100 years to awaken the Mangekyo Non, a shinobi who wanted that power least in all the clan. There was no comfort she could offer that he would accept. Only the truth. He's always loved the clan more than he loved reason. You did what was necessary. Please get up. If you're discovered here, I won't be able to protect you from the police. Itachi shut his eyes, as if the sight of the river stung them, and when he opened them again they had gone black. "I can't," he said hoarsely. She pried away the arm he was clutching to his stomach, to expose a sticky patch on his tunic beneath his ribs. Mikoto clenched her teeth. Short of finding him already dead, it could hardly have been worse. Shisui had carried a dagger of chakra-conducting metal that could cut through chain links like they were cotton string, and couldn't be blocked by mundane steel weapons. Itachi was still conscious, at least, but wouldn't be for long. It would have cut too deep. "Do you expect me to leave you here?" she said fiercely. "Get up." "I can't," he repeated, barely audible. She cursed. How long had he been sitting here? His eyes were unfocused, and his face slick with sweat. She was sure he was going into shock. In the time it took her to get in return, he might very well bleed out even with her first aid. She had planned for this outcome, but it was an option of last resort. She didn't have any choice but to involve them. Her training in medical jutsu was patchy, but she could at least close off the worst of the bleeding. Her hands began to glow as her chakra seeped into the wound. Mikoto focused her concentration on repairing the walls of the torn blood vessels first, biting down hard on her lip in an effort to keep herself from damaging them even further. "I'm going to cast a genjutsu on you to disrupt your pain perception," she said. "Then we're going to find you a medic. Understand?" "Yes," he forced out. She looked into his eyes, and began weaving an illusion that screened out the agony radiating from his belly. Gut wounds didn't kill quickly, but they were excruciating. The physical pain, and his natural reflex to dispel any invasion of his senses, made dampening the pain enough for him to walk a difficult proposition. Even with him conscious of her good intentions, it took a few tries to make the genjutsu hold. His breathing evened out immediately when she succeeded. She draped his arm over her shoulders, and pulled him to his feet. Yuji's home backed the river, about a quarter of a mile down. It was one of the least desirable patches of real estate in the Uchiha district, being prone to mild flooding. The path along the banks was usually muddy in the early spring and seldom used, and there was plenty of tree cover. With Itachi so badly injured, making it there would be a struggle, but being seen would mean death. They picked their way around the puddles of muck, until Mikoto could see the golden glow of a light in her brother's bedroom window. Yuji was waiting for them in the branches of a willow rooted behind the house. He leaped lightly down, and his eyes widened in horror when he saw the lengthening stain on Itachi's shirt. "Ishimaru-san is waiting for you. Everything is ready." He took Itachi's other arm, guiding them inside. Mikoto murmured her understanding, and her thanks. His wife Kaname opened the door, and ushered them in, leading them towards the larger bedroom. She was dressed in full surgical scrubs, her mouth set in a grim line. Itachi was stumbling badly now, and even with the relief offered by her genjutsu was on the edge of unconsciousness. His legs gave out when they reached the stairs. Yuji scooped him up before he could strike his head on the banister, one arm beneath his knees and the other supporting his back, and carried him the rest of the way like a child. Mikoto followed close on his heels. When she passed the threshold of the bedroom, she noticed with a start that Hyuga Kaito was standing silently beside his sensei, dressed in the off-white surgeon's uniform. She wouldn't have involved the boy if it had been her decision, but it was clear Ishimaru trusted his discretion as much as she trusted Ishimaru's. The bed had been cleared of its quilts, and draped in heavy plastic. Yuji laid the barely conscious Itachi down on it. Ishimaru activated the seal painted into the material with a surge of his chakra, and strange diagrams flared to life above the bed. A mobile life support monitor, probably. Kaname got immediately to work cutting off his ruined shirt. She moved to one side, and started in 4 to replenish the lost blood, while Kaito activated his Byakugan and then placed 2 fingers at the base of Itachi's neck. He went limp, and his eyes fluttered closed. Will he? Mikoto began. He'll be fine, Mikoto-sensei, the young Hyuga said, with a reassuring smile, before pulling the surgical mask over his face. It missed his abdominal aorta, and you got him to us quickly. Ishimaru and Kaito knelt on either side of Itachi, conferring in clipped whispers peppered with medical jargon Mikoto couldn't understand. She stepped back against the wall, her arms crossed over her chest, to let the medics work. She hadn't thought about the white-eyed boy in months, but she was grateful he was here. Here, in his element, he exuded confidence, and he worked alongside his master with practiced grace. It was strange to imagine, but he and Itachi were the same age. Although he attended it so briefly, she didn't even remember that they were probably placed in the same class at the academy. Both were prodigies, but it was Itachi, whose skill was taking lives instead of saving them, that was graced with all the accolades. We should let them work, Yuji whispered in her ear. Mikoto nodded, and let him guide her down the hall. He pulled the door closed behind him. You should be heading back, he said softly. Kaname can look after him here for a bit. When he's able to be moved, I can say I found him passed out drunk next to the river, and escorted him home. Would that hold with the other detectives? She asked. Most of them think I'm an idiot, and, well, me doing something idiotic wouldn't exactly be suspicious. It'd give Umbu more time to clean up the site. The police won't have enough evidence to build much of a homicide case, and any tampering can be excused as me stomping around making a mess of things. The medical examiner is one of ours, I can see to it the autopsy doesn't yield anything incriminating. It's out of character for them, but grief and whiskey have made men do stranger things. He sighed heavily, and rubbed his eyes. I'm sorry about Shisui, I know you two were pretty close. I can't even imagine what this must be like for Itachi. Mikoto swallowed past the lump of grief in her throat. Neither can I. She whispered. Chapter 14. The doorbell rang the next afternoon. Mikoto dried her hands on her apron, and was about to answer it, when her husband brushed past her. He threw open the door to reveal Yuji, in his full police uniform, holding up a very pale, unsteady Itachi by the elbow. His hair was unbound, matted with rank river mud, and he looked hungover enough to make their fictional account of how he'd spent last night entirely plausible. Sasuke came trotting down the hall, too, but Mikoto hooked a finger in his collar, drawing him back from the door. I wouldn't get in your father's way at the moment, sweetheart, she whispered. He let her pull him back from the doorframe, and peered around the edge, with one hand against the weathered wood. He was not frequently the target of his father's rage, but he, too, could smell it in the air, and heeded her advice to hang back. Yuji cleared his throat. I'm sorry to bother you, sir, but I found him by the river, and, well, I thought it might be better if I escorted him home. Thank you, Fugaku said, his voice pure ice. But I would not want you to be late for your shift. You should be going. Yuji released Itachi, who only barely remained upright. He bowed before fleeing the yard as quickly as he could. Itachi stepped inside, his eyes on the floor, and dropped down on the step to begin pulling off his shoes. His father slammed the door shut behind him so hard the glass cracked. Where have you been? He roared. You know how important that meeting was. I had other commitments, Itachi said, his voice low. Like hell you did, Fugaku said. Teko-san said he saw you and Shisui drinking yourselves blind when he was on his way to the shrine. I might have expected this from you, but from Shisui? He's been a more dutiful son to me than you ever have, and now you've taken it upon yourself to poison that too? Do you have any regard for your family at all? Like I said, I had other commitments, Itachi answered, and turned away from his father as he rose. It was not out of disrespect, but to conceal a grimace of pain he couldn't completely bury. Fugaku growled deep in his throat, and, for a moment, Mikoto was afraid he was going to forget himself, and try to strike his recalcitrant elder son. Sasuke tensed, and she dug her fingers into his shoulder, to keep him against the folds of her apron. The moment passed, and Fugaku managed to keep the lashing only to words. "That's all you have to say to me?" He snarled at Itachi's back. "Do you have any appreciation for how many times I've defended your behavior to the council? Did it even occur to you how poorly it reflects on my leadership, if I can't command even my own son?" "No," Itachi said. It hadn't. He staggered towards the stairs, past Sasuke and Mikoto, and without sparing them a glance. "You're off the final mission." Fugaku bellowed at his retreating back. "I'm finished with you." Itachi let his father have the final word, and did not turn around. Fugaku stalked off in the opposite direction, seething. Sasuke wiggled free of Mikoto's grip, and took off after his brother, his small face tight with concern. "Are you okay? Why didn't you come home last?" "Leave me alone," Itachi said, but without any of the heat that had singed the words with his father. Sasuke let out an injured sigh, and Itachi turned briefly, taking in his stricken expression. I feel like I'm going to be sick," he muttered by way of explanation, and fled. "I'm worried about you," Sasuke whispered, but stepped back to where Mikoto was waiting, and didn't attempt to follow him. Really worried?" She smiled gently down at him, turning him in the direction of the kitchen with 2 fingers on his shoulder. "Your brother isn't feeling well. He didn't mean it. Let him rest for a while and he'll be fine." "Okay," Sasuke said, still subdued. He'd probably never seen his father that angry before. Fugaku's temper was short, but he rarely lost control so completely as to teeter on the verge of physical violence. "How about some hot chocolate?" she said, with artificial pleasantness. He wrinkled his nose at her from his place at the table, where the cat was twining around the legs. It grumbled at him, begging for treats. "You know I don't like hot chocolate," he said, flicking its soft tail absently. "You always put too much sugar in it." Mikoto clicked her tongue against her teeth. "You know, I think you're the only little boy in the whole village who complains when his mother gives him sweets." Her teasing won a lopsided, short-lived smile. "Want anything else?" she asked. "No," he said, and chewed on his lip for few moments, while Mikoto got the cocoa powder down for herself. "Something's gone wrong," he said. "It's been wrong for a long time, and nobody will tell me what it is." "What do you mean?" she said, shooing the cat away, and kneeling beside him. "That's just it," he said testily. "You already know, and, no matter what I say, you're going to do that mom thing where you pretend to listen to make me feel better, and don't answer any of my questions." Mikoto sat back, tucking her ankles under her. His accusation wasn't groundless. It hurt to lead him around like she had been, but he was much too young to be told about the resistance. "There's no point in lying, I suppose," she said, preparing to skirt the truth so widely she might as well be. "You know this all started since your brother joined Umbu." "Do you know what Umbu does?" "They take the hardest missions, protect the village. They're the best. Everyone knows that." "That's true. Only the best shinobi are chosen to enter Umbu. But the hardest missions to complete aren't always the ones that take the most skill. They have to make very difficult decisions to protect the village as a whole. Sometimes, even hurting the people they love is an unavoidable part of their missions. For someone like Itachi, who's so young compared to his teammates, and still lives with his family, it's especially hard." "So what father said, it's not true?" Sasuke asked in a small voice. "No," she said gently. "Itachi cares about his family very much, especially you. It's just that he and your father disagree on what this means, whether his family or the village should come first. Your father is clan head, and it's his job to take care of the Uchiha first. That's why they haven't been getting along lately." "I think I understand a little better now," Sasuke said contemplatively, and then pursed his lips into a frown. "But that still doesn't tell me why he didn't come home last night, and didn't go to the special meeting either." "Well," she said, as if considering the question. "I know he wanted to talk to Shisui about something. You know his father's been very sick, and he died a couple of days ago. Shisui is probably having a pretty hard time right now, and your brother is one of his best friends. Oh, right, Sasuke said. That makes sense, I guess. I wish things could go back to the way they were. It makes my chest feel bad when I see father and Itachi fight like that. Mikoto put her arm around him, and planted a kiss on his forehead. I know. Sasuke huffed, and rubbed it off with the back of his hand, clearly trying to prove he was much too old for such things. Why don't you go see if Naruto wants to play? Keeping him out of trouble might take your mind off things here. All right, I'll do my best. It's like practice for being in the police. I've got to track down the suspect, and make the arrest, before he strikes again, he said, getting to his feet. I hope he hasn't given the Shodai Hokage a makeover again. We can only hope, she agreed. And Sasuke, I'm sure they'll work it out soon, one way or the other. After the last reverberations of the argument faded away, Mikoto padded quietly to Itachi's bedroom door, and slid it open a fraction. He was in bed, with the shutters closed, and turned away from her. The borrowed clothes lay in a heap in front of it, marring the otherwise immaculate cleanliness that was the usual condition of his room. Can I come in? She asked softly. He grunted, already awake. He opened his eyes, and tried to sit up, but his face went taut with pain. He lay back against the pillows with a barely audible gasp. She adjusted the tray in her hands, and pushed the sliding door open. She stepped over the lintel, closing it with her heel. The clothes she kicked aside, making a mental note to return them to Yuji when she had the chance. Itachi's bloodied garments had already been disposed of, along with the rest of the evidence of his fight. She put the light dinner down on the bedside table, and sat down beside him. He still looked exhausted and ill. Prolonged sessions of chakra-assisted healing put a great deal of strain on the body. He was shirtless, and the sheet had slipped down to his waist in his abortive attempt to rise. Ishimaru and Kaito had done a spectacular job. Although the internal injuries weren't fully healed, the skin had been mended without even a scar to betray him. I brought you some soup, she said. Do you think you could hold it down? His eyes narrowed, irritated by these belated attempts at mothering. I'm not hungry. She picked up the bowl, and held it out to him. I didn't ask if you were hungry. Your chakra is severely depleted. Unless you think you'll throw it up, you need to eat something. Is this necessary? He said coldly. If you eat, I'll leave you alone. He made another attempt to sit up, more carefully this time. Mikoto put the bowl back on the table, and pulled the pillows up, to give him something to lean against. He swallowed the food mechanically, and handed the empty dish back, clearly annoyed at her for treating him like a child, and probably even more annoyed at himself for giving her a reason to. You should know, your Aunt Uroshi found Shisui's body while she was out gathering mushrooms at the riverbank. Someone will be coming to question you soon. She unfolded the unused napkin to reveal 2 pale blue tablets, and held them out to him. What is that? He asked, eyeing them with distaste. He'd never liked taking analgesics, even as a child. The amount of unmitigated suffering he was willing to endure was frankly frightening. For the pain. Please take them, to keep the officers from becoming suspicious, if nothing else. He grudgingly accepted the pills, and swallowed them dry. Mikoto collected the tray, and stood once he'd lain back down. He turned his head away, pulling the blankets back up around his shoulders. This conversation was obviously finished. She shut the door behind her, letting her fingers slip down the frame, and balling them into a loose fist. He may have survived the confrontation, if only barely, but what he said under questioning could mean the life or death of every Uchiha loyal to Konoha. They'd rehearsed his answers a dozen times before the confrontation with Shisui, planning for every eventuality. Itachi accepted this one with his usual cool indifference. It had settled like snow, to cover the ugly wounds beneath. Had any of them ever healed? The pain of every life he'd ever taken, never shared, all the remorse locked beneath the ice? A couple of hours later, someone knocked smartly at the door as Mikoto was heating up some leftovers. She herself had hardly any appetite, but appearances needed to be kept up. She turned off the stove, and threw a handful of utensils in the sink, using the delay to feel out the details of their chakra presence. One was radiating suspicion, the other, grief and a throat-constricting trepidation. She let out a long breath to steady herself. It looked like at least one of the loyalists had talked his way into conducting the investigation. That would make this easier. She padded to the front of the house, and slid the door open. "Oh, Kon-san, Inabi-san," she said deferentially. "Please come in. If you're looking for my husband, I think he's in the garden." In her head, she said a short prayer of thanks. Uchiha Kon was a respected, if not exceptional, detective, just a hair too young to start thinking about retirement. He had considered her father something of a mentor, and that bond had been enough weight to tip his loyalties to her side instead of Fugaku's. For an Uchiha he was unusually level-headed and methodical. If anyone would be able to rein in someone as volatile as Inabi, it would be him. "We need to talk to Itachi." "Get him out here," Inabi said, blunt as always. He wasn't a bad sort, but, when he was agitated, his lack of decorum made dealing with him extremely annoying. And he obviously suspected the events of last night had not been accidental. No matter how thoroughly the Hokage's men had extirpated the evidence of the murder, the timing was too suspicious to ignore. "I'm sorry, but he's asleep. He's feeling really sick to his stomach, so I'd rather not." No excuses. Find him. His suspicions would have to be expertly unraveled, before they entangled anyone else. Inabi had always been envious of her eldest son, of his power, his position, his fame. His partner knew this better than many, and glanced over at him, eyes narrowed. "What is wrong with you?" Kon said sharply. "This isn't some drug bust in Odafuku guy. Mikoto-sama, I'm sorry, but there's been an accident. We need Itachi-sama to answer some questions about what he was doing last night. As far as we know, he was the last person to see the victim alive." Mikoto placed her hand loosely against her lips. "The victim alive?" she repeated, stunned. "Who?" "Uchiha Shisui." She let out a muffled cry, and backed against the wall, as if too weak with shock to stand. Kon took her by the elbow, and eased her down on the steps. "Find Fugaku-sama and explain what happened," he ordered Inabi. "Just the facts, and for God's sake break it gently. If I hear any more of your paranoid ranting, I swear I will skin you alive when we get back to headquarters. I'll be there in a moment." The younger man glared at him from beneath his long hair. "Yes, sir," he said, a little stiffly. He turned, and walked out of the door, towards the gardens that ringed the house. When she judged him far enough away, Mikoto let her feigned sobbing trail off. The talk screen was dealt with. She whispered. "Yes," he answered in the same almost inaudible tone. The medical examiner turned it in positive for extremely high blood alcohol, and nothing else. The bridge is clean too, no signs of a struggle. You know how Inabi can be, it's a murder until proven otherwise. He's never liked Itachi, and I think I can convince most of the department he's a nutcase nursing a grudge. Do you think Fugaku will?" Mikoto exhaled shakily, on the verge of real tears this time. He doesn't want to believe Itachi is capable of something like this, but he's chief of police. A suspect is a suspect. She would do what she could, but the crucial first words to deflect suspicion away from Itachi were his to speak. He had been among the first of the police officers her brother had contacted. He was loyal, he was intelligent, and there was nothing she could do but trust him. "I understand," he said. "For what it's worth, you have my condolences. Shisui was a good man on the wrong side but still a good man." "Mom!" Sasuke called from the inner staircase. "Did you get the door? And is everything okay? I thought I heard someone crying." "Go," Mikoto whispered to Kon. "I have to see to Sasuke, make sure Inabi doesn't ask any smart questions." He rose, and followed his partner into the garden, where she could just hear Fugaku's voice rising in tones of disbelief. She didn't know what this would mean for the continuation of the rebellion. Without Shisui, there was no one the clan council could install as Hokage. It would be too much to hope for that they would back down after such a setback. Her husband was too stubborn. Perhaps he'd even make himself Hokage. Sasuke trotted down the stairs to find her still limp against the wall of the foyer. She made a show of dabbing at her eyes and nose before turning to face him. "That was two of your father's detectives at the door. There was. She swallowed hard. There was an accident. Shisui's body was fished out of the river this morning. He was seen drinking with your brother yesterday. Kon-san thinks he passed out on his way home, and fell over the rail of the Nakano Bridge. Oh, Sasuke said in a small voice. In his eyes, Shisui was part of her generation, already a shinobi when he was born. They hadn't spent that much time together over the years, but Shisui had always been affectionate with him, in some ways treating him with more warmth than his own brother. Did they go tell Itachi? She nodded. They will. Don't bother them. They need to ask him some questions about what he was doing last night. His eyes went wide. They don't think Itachi pushed? No, she said quickly. No, of course not, Shisui is his best, she began, her tongue catching on the present tense. Was his best friend. She pulled herself up, brushing her apron smooth. Why don't you go finish your homework? I'll bring you some dinner when it's warmed up. No, that's okay. I'm not really that hungry, he said, sounding slightly dazed, and withdrew obediently upstairs. Some moments later, Kon slid open one of the screens. Would you tell Itachi-sama we need to speak with him now? This way, please, she said, and led them up the stairs. Itachi was sitting up in bed, looking rumpled, as if he'd come awake to his father's voice below the window. Every nuance of his posture was deliberate. For once, he looked as young as he truly was, and, if not harmless, certainly not a murderer. I heard my father shouting, he said, hesitant, his voice rough with sleep. Did something happen to Shisui? We were assuming you could tell us, Inabi said, locking his arms over his chest. Mikoto-sama, I'm going to have to ask you to wait downstairs. She nodded, without speaking, and withdrew. Itachi was the best liar she had ever met. He knew how to worm his way through an interrogation, all the techniques to deflect even the judgment of a Sharingan. He'd be all right. He had to be all right. She made her way back to the kitchen, and pulled some fish from the stookpot for the cat, to occupy her hands. It set to nibbling daintily on the small plate she set before it, unconcerned about the apprehension striking sparks against the rest of the family. After about 10 minutes, the two detectives descended the stairs, and let themselves out. Mikoto rose, silent on her bare feet, to listen against the screen. Fugaku-sama, he was lying. He knows something, Inabi said. The rest of the council is convinced we have a traitor in our. And you think it's Itachi, of all people? Kon interrupted. There's no evidence. It was an accident. A terrible, terrible accident, but an accident nonetheless. There were no marks on the body, no signs of a struggle at the bridge, no nothing. Judging by the condition Yuji-san found him in, and the BAC we got out of Shisui's remains, he would barely have been lucid enough to put one foot in front of the other by the time they left the bar last night. Which makes it likely he had accomplices, Inabi added triumphantly. Mikoto swallowed. A long time ago, when she had still been a little girl, Konoha had suffered a cold snap the likes of which the village had never seen. Under the supervision of the eldest children, the younger ones had thrown themselves into the marvelous whiteness with abandon. Covered with a layer of pristine snow, Mikoto hadn't been able to see the banks of the frozen pond that, in the summer, she knew well to avoid. She only realized her play had taken her over water, and not land, when the ice beneath her feet began to crack and groan. Then, as now, she could feel everything supporting her buckling, a helpless panic burning up her legs, her belly, her chest. Someone had saved her then, but... He's my son. Fugaku cried suddenly, livid. My son. Sir, I only meant that we should consider the possibility, Inabi said, stumbling back into the formalities he'd so casually tossed aside before. Get out of my house, Fugaku said. That is an order. Out. Two sets of footsteps beat a hasty retreat out of the front gate. Mikoto slid down the support beam until his knees struck the floor, and stayed there, panting. Then, as now, it had been Uchiha Fugaku that had saved her life. It was nearing midnight. The door to his study was open a fraction. He had a single glass, and what had been a mostly full bottle of shaku on his desk. She inserted her fingers into the gap, and pushed the sliding door open wide enough for her to slip inside. The dull desolation in his expression sparked into annoyance. What? With Shisui gone, what are we going to do? She asked. Do I look like I know? He snapped. He drained what was left of the glass, and brought it down hard on the desktop. What could he have been thinking? He muttered under his breath. Selfish, disobedient child. He was grieving. Please don't hold it against him. I meant Itachi. He barked. This is his fault. Everything has been his fault. Shisui's dead. We have no one to place in the position of Go-Daime Hokage. The clan's fragmenting. The rest of the council think I'm a sentimental fool for defending him for so long and there. He trailed off into a low growl. He knew. He knew exactly what Itachi had done, and had become, and yet, at least for now, the part of him that was a father held at bay the part that was an officer. The entire rebellion had been, at its heart, for Itachi's sake. He demanded nothing less than perfection of his children, but in return meant to give them the world. Maybe, this is a sign, she said quietly. To call off the coup, without a strong Uchiha Hokage we won't be able to hold against Iwagakure. Try resuming the talks with the village council. The Hokage may. Without warning, he slung the empty glass at her face. She withdrew behind the door with a gasp, and it shattered against the beam. Don't you dare, he snarled. We'll move ahead as planned if I have to take the Hokage's mantle myself. Get out. Mikoto bowed her head, and slid the door shut, the glass grinding against the runners. It was nothing more and nothing less than what she had expected. Shisui's funeral was held 3 days later. It was well attended, but the mourners seemed eager to pay their respects to his mother, and leave as quickly as possible. No one expected the most powerful of the Uchiha to die piss-drunk at the bottom of the river. Itachi endured their stares and whispers in stiff silence. As Shisui's only student, he was given a place of honor before the altar, but declined to say a word beyond half-hearted murmurs of thanks in response to the condolences offered by the rest of the clan. His father, very conspicuously, gave his to Shisui's mother alone. From that day forward, the tension in the house was so thick it was difficult to draw a breath when father and son were in the same room together. They didn't speak, except out of necessity. They barely even looked at each other. Itachi was no longer invited to council meetings. His place as leader of Assault Team 1 was quietly passed to his second. Itachi avoided the house as much as he possibly could. He no longer even ate his meals with his family. In short, Fugaku had disowned his elder son in every way, short of signing the legal documents that would remove him from the inheritance of his father's title. All of the care and attention her husband had spent on Itachi he now gave, unreservedly, to Sasuke. He began asking for his class standing and his weapon-throwing averages. In between meetings of the Jonin Council, and the preparations for the action on the Nadaime's birthday, he carved out time to train Sasuke personally, in ever more advanced katonjutsu. The little boy blossomed under his attention. It inspired him to succeed in a way that Mikoto's own encouragement never quite reached. He cut short his playtime with Naruto to spend yet more hours training at the edge of the pier, returning late at night with his lips scorched and his chakra so drained he could barely put one foot in front of the other. To him, it seemed as though all his dreams for his father to finally recognize him had come true. Every time Mikoto had smiled and said, "Yes, of course your father loves you," it was tangible now. Mikoto had never seen him so happy. But every one of his smiles left a bitter taste on her lips, because soon, very soon, the man was probably going to die. That's it for part 4. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.